Hi, everyone. It is Jess with Jess Smith Coaching here. I hope your day is off to a beautiful start. And I am so excited to introduce you to my friend that I have on the line today, Dan Irvin. Hi, Dan. How's it going?
It's going great. It's going good. Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited. And so Dan is an experienced leader in sales, operations, and building peak performance teams. And most importantly, he is a husband, dad, self-care enthusiast. He's someone who's passionate about leadership and also a college football fan, which is super fun. So you guys, what Dan is up to right now, he's taking on short-term consulting assignments. He's taking on different speaking engagements like this one with me. And he's doing all of this while he's also pursuing a long-term corporate job opportunity. And so what I really admire about Dan is that he's looking for the right position and not just any position. And so some of the things that he told me that he's looking for is a company that's progressive, that is in growth mode, and a company that really wants to elevate their culture and their talent as a path to success, which I thought was awesome. So he's also really defined what he's looking for too. And so I was talking to Dan last week, and we were talking about how he's managing, the consulting work, speaking, job search, all of these different pieces. And what really stood out to me about you, Dan, was how intentional you are
Mm.
being with your job search and your time. And really, it seemed just like your overall life, you're being very intentional. And so that's really the topic that we want to focus on today is having an intentional career search and an intentional life that spills over into that too. So I'll kick it over to you, Dan. Would love to have you start us off by chatting a little bit about what does it mean to you to be intentional,
Mm.
and tell us about some of the ways that you're being intentional with your job search.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me. I'm really appreciative to be here and just share a little bit about how I think and why I think that way, and how intentionality has really shaped the way that I go about really everything I do each week. Intentionality for me really started with getting really clear about what my priorities are in life. Right. And you and I talked about this before, but for me, it's super clear. And I share with anyone that'll listen to me that my priorities are very simple. Self-care is number one. It's that idea that I've got to take care of myself, put the mask on you before you help other people type of mentality. And self-care also often gets just lumped into like exercise or diet or things like that. But self-care is way more than that, right? It's ensuring that you're allocating the appropriate amount of time to mental health, emotional health. And I'm a parent, like you mentioned. And so, providing that stability and time with my family is also part of self-care. So self-care is a very robust topic that often gets limited. So anyways, number one is self-care. Number two for me is family. And then number three is vocation. And so if my job or future job needs more of me than my self-care or my family, it's not gonna be a good fit. And so there's several ways. You may not know that. I certainly don't know that in the when I first start talking to people, right? But as you start going down the path of connecting with new opportunities and new jobs, you start understanding that through different language that's used or just questions or answers to those questions. And so for me, that's really where intentionality starts, is that I am categorizing or really prioritizing my week based on that order. I often use the visual example, and I don't have it here with me today, but if you'll visualize the idea that self-care is the large rock, family is the medium-sized rock, and the vocation's the small rock, right? If you put it in the small, medium, large order, not everything's going to fit in the container.
Mm.
You've got to put the big rocks in first, then the medium-sized rocks, and then the small rocks, and everything will fit. And so I have the same amount of time as everyone else, right? And so I want to be really intentional about getting the big rocks in first and then the medium-sized ones. And so that's where it starts for me, the priorities. And then the other two things with intentional mindset that come to mind are just being authentic with who I want to be. And so oftentimes that manifests itself in my conversations with folks and just being brutally honest. But for me, that started with actually knowing what it is. I often find people don't really write down what their priorities are or what their core values are. And so they have an idea of what they are, but they can't really verbalize them, right? Like the priorities thing, I can just rattle off to you because it's easy and I know it. I mean, I live it. And then my core values, I literally have them written right here in front of me on the wall, and what they mean to me, right? And so, I mean, it's because I set aside the time. I was intentional about really understanding what those were.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And this kind of goes to the video that I posted on LinkedIn yesterday, is like, how often are we like driving towards something, but we haven't defined like what it looks like. Like you said, I took the time to sit down and figure out like, these are my values. This is what's important to me. These are my priorities. And so I think a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this myself too, where it's like, I have my priorities, but it's like, but what are they? What are they exactly?
And I absolutely, if you don't write them down, you don't know what they are, then it's hard to talk about them. I mean, we all have values in our life. And if I was to force you to sit down and really think about it, you'd pump out some amazing information. I mean, you could do it, but it's being able to do it on a dime. And no one's asking anyone to memorize it, right? You can have it written down and have it in eyesight. So that way, when you do want to talk about it, you can just refer to it. And I think that's important, just to have it available, have it visible. I'm also a visual person, right? And so having things in front of me all the time, what you can't see literally right in front of me is a whole bunch of information. Core values is up there. But what takes up the majority of my wall that you can't see are pictures of my family. Because that's what drives a lot of what I do, right? And so that visual component to it. So yeah, that's how I'm intentional in that mindset. That's how I'm intentional in my conversations. And then one other tip that I when you were saying that, Jess, that made me think about it, is that I actually created a document that lists out all 8 of my core values, the ones that I prioritize, and the meaning and what they mean to me personally. And oftentimes when I'm applying for jobs, it asks, like when you're applying, there's that option to put additional documents. And oftentimes we put referral documents or maybe cover letters. I always upload that. Now, I don't know if it gets looked at or not, but the company that I'm looking for is going to look at that and is going to value that.
Yeah, completely. And so I like that you bring this into the job search aspect, because I'm kind of thinking about this too from like a job seeker standpoint. It reminds me of, people going into an interview and not really being able to articulate like why they want this position. And so it's really like that intentionality around like, why do I want this? What am I doing? Ends up being really important when you try to articulate that in a interview. And like you said, you don't have to memorize it, but to have it written down and to like consciously know what they are, then your brain has a path to like go to that when someone's asking you about it.
It's one of the first things that I go to when I'm doing research on a company. Like if I hear back from an organization and they want to interview me or whatever that first step is, that's the first spot that I go to. So I go to their website, or I go look at all the information about the position. I go look at reviews, and I try and look for commonalities in my core values. And so that's where I start. So when I have those initial conversations and they say, well, what, one of the first questions you always get asked is, why are you interested in working here? Yeah. Well, instead of saying, well, to kind of the generic answers, I immediately go into kind of my ideology behind my core values and how I have 8 of them. And I found by doing research that 3 or 4 or however many align exactly with the company's core values. And here's what that means to me. So one of my core values is loyalty, right? And so I saw on your website that you do this for customers, or you do this for your employees, or you even those types of things, or having discipline is one of my core values. And so relating what I've learned about them to my core values is where I normally kick off those conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's a great place to start, because you're also showcasing that you did research on the company too.
Exactly. So yeah, job search intentionality is so important. I mean, I often talk to folks that are kind of just waiting for the LinkedIn or Indeed or Glassdoor job recs just to come through, right? And then I'll look at that list and then I'll move forward. That's one way to do it, and I certainly do that too. But that's kind of icing on the cake for me. If it comes through or not, then great. But I'm being I'm taking action on what I know is important to being intentional in the job search. So first for me, the goal is to be top of mind for people, right? And so I want to do things that put me top of mind. So I have a whole slew of things that I do, from the video content that I put on LinkedIn to one-on-one conversations like you and I had last week. And there's limitations around that, and I don't overdo it. And we can talk a little bit about that later. But I want to be top of mind. And so, I connect with as many people that want to connect on LinkedIn. I know there's two kind of thought processes on that. I lean towards the side of I want more connections because I want to be more visible. Right. And so there's very specific activity that I'm doing because my goal is to be more visible. Right. And then I'm figuring that into my week. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just being consistent with my activities. So often I hear people that are like, yeah, I tried that, but it didn't work for me. And gracefully, I will ask them, how long did you try it? Mm-hmm. And they're like, a week. A week? Nothing works after a week, right? And so, just being consistent with it. I often also talk about being in this experimental mindset, right? And really putting time, longevity to the experiment, 30, 60 days, right? And really just being consistent and then looking at the outcomes from that. And then lastly, I would say, Jess, is like another way that I'm intentional in the job search is know where to say no. Oftentimes we're pulled in many directions, and I'm not just talking about, different job opportunities, because you certainly need to know what you want so you can say no to job opportunities. But more so, I'm talking about, people monopolizing your time, technology monopolizing your time. I mean, these tech companies these days are paid to get our attention and keep our attention. I'll tell you one little tidbit. I have 0 notifications that come through on my phone.
Wow. That's unique.
Some people look at that or hear that and they're like, I couldn't live life that way. And, like 2 years ago, I would have said the same thing. But for 2 years now, maybe 2.5, I've turned off all notifications.
Yeah. So are you just going into things when you're ready to look at it?
Yeah. So I'm being intentional about when I'm using those tools. It's funny because I'll be like, yeah, you nailed it. I do not look at technology. Let me rephrase. I look at technology when I want to, not when the technology tells me to look at it. Yeah. And so but I find, probably on average once a day, I'm going into my social accounts. But before it was dozens, right? Because if you're anything like me and you're kind of organized and disciplined, you don't want the little red number on any of your icons because it will just drive you batty. Yeah. If you're like my wife, who literally it says like 40,000 unread emails. I mean, and she doesn't care. I don't even know how she operates or can look at her phone and see that number on there. Then it doesn't bother you. But for people like me, I see that red thing and I'm like, oh, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. And that carries over into my family time, right? I mean,
totally.
Whenever I'm doing something, I want to be all in doing that thing.
Yeah, that's so great. Yeah, I'm more on your wife's page where I let things build up, but then it does cause me anxiety, right? So that's not necessarily a great strategy, but that's kind of where I end up too. But I think that's awesome to turn off the notifications, especially when you're really trying to focus in on something like job searching. Like that's an intense process. There's a lot of work to be done there. And
let me add something to that if I can.
Yeah.
So I create time every day to do that type of work, right? I mean, it's not that I'm going days without looking at my social sites or days without looking at my email. The way that I set up my week, and I'll give you a generic view of it, but a generic thought around it is that I have a morning time, an afternoon time, and an evening time to do kind of that admin type of work, right? Because otherwise, and the other thing too is like even on my Gmail, on my email, I have a program on there called Boomerang. I love that program, by the way, that will actually pause your inbox. So you don't, and you can tell it when to deliver email to you. Because otherwise what I find, I mean, I have to have my email up because typically I'm working through my inbox. That's my to-do list to get things done, or I
Mhm.
have to reference different emails. But if I see that I have unread emails, I think we all do this. We're like, what is that? I need to go look at it. Right. And again, it pulls our attention. It's another distraction. It's telling me when I need to look at it versus me controlling that, and it's taking me off task. And so I design time in my day. And so it's interesting, right? Like 8 o'clock, 8 to 8:30 every day. That's the morning admin time, and then 12:30, and then 5 o'clock every day I do admin. And so I actually have that program Boomerang deliver my email at 8, 12:30, and 5.
Wow.
You
That's
know,
super
and
intentional.
and it makes it super easy for me. And then, because here's the thing, people are like, well, I don't want to miss an email. First of all, it's dumping 3 times a day in my box, so I'll get it. Secondly, if it's that critical, Jess, they'll call me. Email's not sent for an emergency, right? People call.
Hmm.
The same thing with text, right? I mean, people, if it's an emergency, for the most part, they're going to call. If it can wait a few hours, they're going to text or email.
Yeah, completely. I think that's amazing. And because like you said, it's like you see that notification and we've been so trained to like go look at it. And it's like once you break your focus from whatever you're working on, it's so much harder to bring the focus back to the actual task, especially when it's repeatedly pulling you away, pulling you away. So your attention is not really focused on either. You're not really focused on anything. So would love if you could talk a little bit about that too.
Sure. We're not designed to multitask. Not at all. We're just not. Our brains are not designed. We can do multiple things at once, but we don't end up doing any of those things well. We do them and they get done. It's just like when I'm spending time with my kids. If I have my phone out, yeah, I hear them talking to me, but I'm reading whatever's in on the email. I'm not doing either of those well because I'm probably going to have to reread whatever I read because they're talking and they got questions for me and they want to spend time with me. And there's a much larger parental responsibility issue that I have with that anyways, that I've around self-care, that I want to be a better father than that. But you're just not doing anything well when you're trying to do all things, right?
Mhm.
It's just like driving a car. I mean, think about how much we multitask when we're driving a car and why there's so many laws around texting, right? And the idea that you can't focus on driving when you're staring at a screen, right? And so anyways, our brains are not created to do that. And so when we are pulled away, and it happens. I mean, listen, I have 3 kids and I have a wife and I have a dog and I have things that happen. I have my office is right here at the front of the house where the front door is and people, deliveries or whatnot. There's things that pull you away, but as much as you can control, you want to have control of that because again, we're not designed to do that. I often refer to this. I don't know if we talked about this before or not, Jess, but I often refer to this as this idea, this hustle fallacy.
Hmm.
We're kind of in this social world today where being busy is some kind of currency for people.
Mhm.
Being busy actually means that you're successful is what people kind of associated with, at least what I've found. And I have learned I've been doing this for a couple of years now, where people, when they ask me like, how's it going? What are you up to? I think our knee-jerk reaction often is like, I'm busy. I got a lot of things happening, right? Well, we're all busy. We all got things happening. I mean, who cares, right? What are you actually working on? What's passionate? And so when people ask me that now, and I still have to like consciously be aware of it, but it's one of those triggers now. It's like one of those, I hear it and immediately like snap out of whatever autopilot life I was living at that moment. But where I actually dive into something I'm working on. Like I try to really think about a passion project that I'm currently in the process of, which by the way is a way more engaging answer than I'm busy,
Yeah.
right? And so that's to me, I'm trying to break that habit. And as you said, we are conditioned to feel busy, to talk about how busy we are, and then to be validated by the different social sites and the different things that we're receiving each and every minute, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I call it my achiever. My inner achiever wants to be busy, and my inner achiever determines my worth based on what I'm accomplishing and what tasks I'm getting done, which is a lie. none of our worth is based on, how busy we are and what we're achieving and all of that kind of stuff. But that's like the world that we live in today. So I think it's really important to be aware of that achiever voice. Like you said, once you create awareness, you're like, oh, there it is again. Okay, let's not play into that. Like, let's be more intentional about our response here.
And it's just not sustainable,
Mhm.
right? I mean, if your worth, and you articulated it beautifully, and I would just add to it that if your worth is tied up in you achieving things, you're never going to be worthy because there's always things to achieve. I
Mhm.
mean, we are, one of the great things about humans is that we're designed to typically to hit a goal, then reset the goal,
Mhm.
right? And I think one of the issues with that is that we don't actually give ourselves time to celebrate it.
Right.
Um, and so I have 20 goals here in 2020 that I'm working on throughout the year. Every one of those goals have a celebration component to them.
Love it.
So when and there's celebration like I'm going to buy this thing for myself, or I'm going to spend the day at a theme park with the kids or family or whatever, right? Or it could just be going to one-on-one dates with all three of my kids to their favorite location, right? And so it's things that it could be anything, right? But they all have a celebration component to it, to keep me motivated. Because again, I know that naturally I'm just going to say, "Oh, I hit the target. Now what's the new target?" And I do that, but I want to take a moment to really plan out the celebration of that too.
Yeah. And I think that's so great because I've even noticed in my life, especially for goals that tend to be a little bit longer term, where sometimes I'm so like future based in what's next, what's next, what's next. Sometimes I look around and I'm like, oh my God, I'm living the goal from last year, right? But it's like I haven't even acknowledged it or celebrated it because I'm already on to like the next thing, which is ridiculous if you think about it.
It is ridiculous. I mean, you just gave me goosebumps when you said that, uh, because we put so much time and thought and emotion into achieving a goal,
Mhm.
right? And then it's like you said, it could be like a long-term goal, like multi-month, maybe a year. Well, we get so used to working towards the goal. We finally hit the goal, and we're like, well, time to move on. And what we don't do, and you articulated it well, is that we don't go back to think about how we felt when we set the goal
Mhm.
and what we kind of promised ourselves what life would look like and what we might do, because we just got worn down by the process of going towards the goal. So that's why I like to set the celebration component of the goal when I'm writing the goal, because that it's exciting then, right? And so I want to be able to have that same energy and excitement when I achieve it.
Yeah, yeah, that's so great. Awesome. So I'm going to change directions a little bit.
Okay, perfect.
So a job search has lots of different moving parts. You've got like your resume happening, places you applied to, people you've talked to. How do you keep yourself organized with all the different things that are going on?
So a couple tools. I mean, there's some tech tools that I use, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm super organized, super disciplined, and so I have a pretty detailed spreadsheet that I keep. That I again, consistency and activities, right? And so every Monday morning, I sit down and I review the previous week's activities. Everything from jobs applied to job denials. That's also important to me. I want to know how many of those denials I got so I can see if there's a trend in that. To number of connections, because connections are important to me, because again, one of my goals is to be more top of mind. And so all the things I track are measurable outcomes from what the goals are in the job search process. So once you identify what your goals are and really what you want to achieve, then you take a step back and say, okay, what are the elements that are going to help me achieve that? And then you start tracking that data, right? And so I use a spreadsheet, again, like I mentioned, to track all of that, including, because one of my goals is to be seen, is that I post typically around nowadays 5 or 6 posts a week, and in a mixture of visual or video. And so I want to know what types of posts perform the best. And so I will track on a week-to-week basis on a 30-day rolling schedule. Stick with me here. on how posts are performing from a views and a reaction count. Okay. So after 30 days, it falls off my list. I don't track it anymore. And the reason I go for 30 days is because the list is just like 6 months now, and it would be too much. It would take too much time to track it. And really old content like that doesn't really matter because of the world that we live in. Everything's changing so often. In fact, 30 days is probably pretty elevated. I could probably go 2 weeks and be good, but I just like the numbers. I'm a numbers guy.
Yeah.
But I like to be able to look back and say, okay, over the last 30 days, and I do this every week, what are my best performing posts? And why? Can I understand why? If I can understand why, can I do more of that? Again, my goal is to be seen, to be visible. And so I'm trying to get more views, right? And so I try to find commonalities and trends in that based on number of views and number of reactions. And so I track that. It's in a spreadsheet. It's really detailed. I would show it to you, but it's probably more detailed than you want. But if anyone's watching this and wants to actually see it, I'm more than happy to share it with you. So that's one thing that I do to kind of keep up with that. And then I talked about Monday mornings that I review all those pieces. I guess another thing that I do tracking wise is that, like I mentioned earlier, I set goals every year. So I know what my goals are for this year. And stick with me here. So at the beginning or at the end of the year, I set the next year's goal. So in December, I sat down for literally a day and really thought through it. It was actually like a day and a half, and thought through it all and created the goals. Well, then every quarter I sit down and look at, okay, how did I, what of those 20 goals are due this quarter? Mm-hmm. Okay, now let me organize that. All right. And now what are the milestones of each one of those goals over the next 90 days? And where do I need to be to accomplish them? Mm-hmm. Right. So I create these milestones of, I want to be at this number. I think the easiest thing to talk about is like number of connections, right? And so I know that in order to stay on track through the end of this quarter, which is just a few weeks away, I need to be averaging 500 new connections a week, mm-hmm. right? And so that's one of the, again, I mentioned on my tracking sheet, I have that number, and I actually run the formula on there to show how many did I actually net new in the previous week. But I planned that all out for the quarter in March for Q2, right, for April, May, and June, to say I need to be at 500 a week. And so I track that accordingly. And then I think the other thing you mentioned specifically, like how do you remember to follow up with people, right? Mm-hmm. Like you send an email to somebody and it's like, how do you remember to say like, oh, I haven't heard back from you? Right. I've talked to many people that like track all that in a spreadsheet. That's certainly one way to do it. The way that I do it is actually with technology. And so that Boomerang app, I don't get paid by Boomerang. I don't know why I keep mentioning them other than I just use it literally every day. Is that along with telling it when to dump email into your inbox, this is what I talked about earlier, there's also a thing where you can just tell it to come return back to you on whatever date you want. Mm. Right. And so like if I send an email off, I can go to my sent box and Boomerang that back to me in a week or 30 days or whatever the case is. And so it'll actually it'll go away. It goes out of my inbox because I'm inbox zero guy, right? If it's in my inbox, it's a to-do item that I haven't gotten to yet. Yeah. Right. And so when that pops back up, again, that works for me because that's how I operate my email. Mm-hmm. Right. If you're my wife, that is a nightmare because you have a billion emails, right? So you got to find what works for you and how you think and how you operate, and then find tools that'll actually allow you to do that well. I think oftentimes speakers or trainers or in workshops, they're like, well, this is what worked for me, so you have to do it this way. No, that's not true. Like the concept is what worked for you. Now find the tools and the technology to help you do it. And so I am always I like to try to stay in that experimental mode. And I always have space and time to test out or to research new technologies. Because if you put a little bit of work in on the front end, which sometimes it can be arduous work and it's just like, oh, I got to find another tool. Ugh. Well, listen, I put a little bit of work in on the front end of these tools. Then I don't have to think about it ever again. And it now saves me time forever.
Right. Right. Yeah. Major benefit on the back end. Well, and I think this is great because one of the things that I do with clients is like, okay, let's acknowledge what's working and what's not working. And that's like even being intentional, right? Intentionally evaluating like what you've been doing. And like you said, with all of the tracking. And so it sounds like such a simple concept, but it's surprising how many of us aren't doing that, where it's like if we could just acknowledge, okay, here's what's working. I sent this template as a reach out to people and I got this many responses back. Okay, it's working. Let's do more of that. I sent this
Mhm.
other template, no responses. Let's not do that anymore. It's just like being intentional and conscious of like, what am I doing and what are my results? And then just knowing that those results are neutral. And if it's not working, you get to shift and find a different avenue, something that works for you.
And knowing that it's a process,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it didn't work this week. Now I need to scrap everything and start over.
Right.
It's no. It's oftentimes just little tweaks here and there. And then to your point, I mean, if you're not tracking it, how do you know that feeling that it's not working versus knowing that it's not working are two different things,
Right.
right? And one response this week versus zero last week is a 100% change,
Yes, completely.
right? It's also how we frame the change and how we think about the difference, and how we put space in our mind for that. So it's we often are, oh, maybe I shouldn't go down this path, but we often are keeping up with the Joneses in many parts of our lives, right? I mean, you heard that expression, obviously, and
Mhm.
the idea that like, well, I know this guy. Some people, I'll use me. Some people say, well, I know you're doing all this video work, and you're sending all these video messages out, and I mean, you're getting like thousands of views on the stuff you're doing today. That's happening, right? 4 months ago when I started this I mean, and I mentioned earlier, and some people may have cringed when I said I put out 5 or 6 pieces of content. Now I do that. 4 months ago, my goal literally was to put out one post a week. One, right?
Yeah.
And then I started being like, well, this is easy. So then I went to two. And I mean, I did like one post a week for 2 weeks, and I was like, okay, I can definitely do more. So then I was like, well, let me double it, right? Let me go to two.
Yeah.
And then it just slowly grew into me creating processes, me creating systems, finding technology that allows me to do it. Now I'm doing 4, 5, 6 a week in the same time that it took me to do 4 months ago.
Right. And I like that you had like it was attainable the whole way. You didn't start out saying, I'm going to post 6 times a week. Like, let's start with 1. Okay, I've got it. Let's do 2. Okay, got it. So that way you can feel good along that process as opposed to making a goal that's totally, not totally unattainable, but very difficult to attain, perhaps. And then feeling like crap when you don't get it on the first or second shot.
Yeah, and we oftentimes are. That's what my point was earlier. Is that we oftentimes are comparing ourselves to other people,
Hmm.
and it's just unfair. It's unfair to us, and it's unfair to them because they didn't start there. They started where you're trying to start.
Right.
Um, and so I would encourage people who are like, man, how does that person do that thing? I would say one of the questions you need to ask them is, where did you start?
Hmm.
What was your plan in the beginning? I know where you are now. And then oftentimes it's going to be exactly what we just talked about, right? It was, oh, I didn't even think I could do 1 or 2 a week. But now here I am.
Right. Yeah, completely. Thank you. That's great. And so we're out of time, Dan, but tell everyone where they can find you if they want to connect over consulting, job opportunities, more leadership info, organization info. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I would love for you to find me on LinkedIn. That's where I put all of my content. And so you can find me at Dan Irvin, IRV as in Victor, IN, um, on there. And like I said, I'm putting videos out there and different pieces of content, really in an effort to be abundant, to share, and just to help other people.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing with us today, Dan. Really, really appreciate the insights and the strategies. And just, I think what I'm taking away from this is things are possible, right? It's just like taking the steps and using the process to get there one day at a time.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Bye, you guys. We'll see you next time.